Today we're going to look at Chapter 1 in Section 1.1. Our objective today is going to be recognizing points, lines, line segments, rays, and angles. So whenever we are dealing with geometry, geometry is going to be very different from algebra. And the basis of geometry right now is we have to think of it like a language, okay? Just like learning the English language or any other language. Maybe you're taking Spanish or French or German or whatever. You are going to have to understand the very basics. You need to know letters in different languages. You have to know meanings of different words and so on and so forth. Geometry is like a language. And so we're going to be looking at a lot of vocabulary and symbols that represent a bunch of these vocabulary words. So at any point, I would highly suggest that you pause the video as I'm going through these words. Make sure you're writing everything down. And like I said, pause the video if it's going too fast and you are still writing. Okay, so our first vocabulary word is point. The description of what a point is that it's represented by a dot. Okay, so once you have the word and the description written down, you are going to sketch a quick picture of what represents that vocabulary word. And then I'll also write if there's any special type of notation that is going to go with that vocabulary word. So represented by a dot. Notice that obviously that's a dot, or here's a dot, or here's a dot. What else is going to be with those dots though would be something like this. A letter A, a B, or C. However, notice that every single time I wrote those letters, for as far as our notation goes, you have to have capital letters. So our notation, we must have capital letters. Okay, a lowercase a is not going to represent a point. It has to be a capital letter A, and so on and so forth. So for those that like to write everything in lowercase, this is going to be a little bit of getting used to. You have to have everything capitalized when we're talking about a point. Our next vocab word is a line. Lines are made up of points and they are straight, meaning that there's no curves involved. So a picture to demonstrate what a line is. Something like this. Notice that we have no curves in this picture. A line continues going infinitely in either direction. So that's why there are arrows on both sides. Okay. One way that we are going to note this picture is if I have, here is a lowercase letter. I have it in cursive just so you understand that that's an L. Okay, so as far as how would I write this, I would call this line L. Okay, so we would write the word line and then we would have our lowercase letter. Another picture would be, once again, there's no curves to this. We have arrows in either direction because a line continues and continues and continues. However, if I was to throw a couple of specific points on here, let me write them, like point M, N, and P. Notice that these are all capital letters. Okay, in order to indicate the name of this line, you would just pick two of those letters. So like M and N, and then you would put a little line above it. Okay, you could also have picked the letters M and P and then put a line above it. Okay, so as long as you pick 2 points that are on that line and have that line symbol above it. So that meant that I could have picked N and gone to P. Okay, because it continues with those arrows going in both directions. That's why you only need 2 of those points. And if you have more than 2 points on the line, you just pick 2 points and you could write them forwards or backwards. So I could have technically taken P first and then gone to M. And so there's a lot of different ways for me to name this line, but there's just a few of them. A segment is made up of points. It's straight and it has a distinct beginning and end. So a picture to represent what a segment would be is that it starts at a point, there are no curves to it, and it ends at a point. So I'm going to call this point J and point K. All right, so there's no other specific points that I've labeled in between those two. It starts at a point, it ends at a point. And so, as far as my notation for how I would write this particular picture, I would use the symbols. I'd start with J and go to K. And notice that I just put a little segment bar above it. There are no arrows when we're talking about segments because it starts at a point or it ends at a point. So that's why I could have technically then flipped it around. I could have started with K and gone to J. So whatever begins and ends it, you can flip those letters around as far as how you write the notation of it, but there are no arrows when you are representing a segment. Array. The array is made up of points, straight. It has a distinct beginning, but then it extends infinitely in one direction. So starts at a point and extends infinitely in one direction. So notice that there's only one arrow in this picture. So call that point R, and then I'm going to throw a couple of more points on this ray. So S and T are two other points that are on this ray. Okay, notice that the very first points that starts the ray is R. So we call that the end point. So in this case, the end point is that point R, okay? It's the farthest from the side away from the arrow. And so whenever we are naming and using the notation, we must start with the end point. So that's why it's very important that you identify what is the point that starts the ray, because when we name it with our notation, you have to start with it. So since R is our endpoint, I start with R, and then I could just go to S. And then notice that my notation above it looks just like a ray. There is no arrow by the endpoint of R, but after R, there is one arrow because it extends infinitely in one direction. And notice that S is a direction in which the arrow is going to continue extending. The other way that you could have written it has to start with R, but then you could have skipped over that point S and you could have gone to T. But once again, you have to have the symbol of array where it starts at that endpoint of R, so there's no arrow on the left, and then there is an arrow on the right to indicate that it's extending infinitely in that direction. Angle. It's made up of two rays with a common endpoint. We call that endpoint the vertex. So if I draw a picture of an angle looks something like this. Notice that if I call that X, Y, and Z. Okay, so notice that we actually have two rays in this. The common endpoint, notice, would be Y because there is no arrow there. This point right here starts the rays in either one of those directions. So when we are naming the angle, we could use that little angle symbol. And then we have to have where those two rays connect, that vertex, that where the two endpoints are meeting, the same endpoint, that is going to have to go in the middle if I'm using those three letters. So I could call this angle X, Y, Z. I could use the angle symbol, but I could have started with Z and gone Z, Y, X. When there is just one single angle in this picture, I could just call this angle Y. So whatever the vertex is, which I have to know what the vertex is, that could just be a single letter in this. You don't have to use three necessarily to name an angle. The other thing is if I was to throw a number inside the vertex here, like if I threw the number 3 in there, I could actually call this angle 3. So this one picture gives me 4 different ways to write what that angle actually represents.